Awesome. Okay, so this is an hour or an hour and 15, where all of us will talk through our personal experiences to answer all the questions you had left over from before, but feel free to keep them coming in the chat. And I originally included this slide to give you some prompts, but it's been very clear that we don't need any prompts because loads of great questions have been coming in. So we'll take it from there. So let's start with some questions we've had around application strategy. I'll quick fire through a few of these because there are so many good ones around commercial awareness and networking and testing that I want you guys to focus on later. So firstly, someone said, for first year schemes, would you recommend waiting to get your grades before sending out applications, especially for ones that close in January to March? Or would you say there's no preference? And I think it depends. If a scheme is designed for first years, then most first years won't have got their grades until far later in the year. So there's no reason not to apply just because you don't have your grades. I think if you've got really low grades in your first year, but you know you're on track to do far better in your second year and you're applying for internships, then maybe wait until you've got those grades, because that's kind of a clean slate and firms will see that you've really improved your approach academically. Someone else said, a few people have asked questions about whether they should do a VAC scheme or apply straight for a training contract. In that sense, I would say, well, firstly, it depends on whether you're eligible to apply for a VAC scheme. Some firms say only second years or penultimate years can do it, whereas if you're a graduate, that might not be an option. If you've got the luxury of time and you can try out different firms, that's always going to be the best, because if you see a few different firms, it will give you a better idea of what you're looking for and which culture resonates with you. But ultimately, it can be as difficult, if not more difficult, to get a VAC scheme as it can to get a training contract. If you secure a VAC scheme, you might then have all sorts of additional assignments and assessments and interviews throughout that process. So I don't think it's necessarily an easier route going via a VAC scheme first. But if you're a second year and you've got loads of time, then you may as well try out a few different firms. One final one from me says, if you don't secure a training contract by the end of final year, should you still go ahead and apply for the LPC or the SQE, or wait another cycle and apply again? It's a very personal decision. These courses are incredibly expensive. I personally couldn't have afforded to do the LPC if a firm wasn't paying for it, so that was a massive consideration for me. But if you can afford it, or you know that if you end up not being a lawyer, it'll be really useful for you or really interesting, then of course it's an option. When I have a friend that didn't apply for training contracts until he had started the GDL and he put himself through that, and then he applied for one firm, got a training contract, and then qualified there as a lawyer. So it really, really depends, but it's very much a personal choice. So moving away from that, Ali, let's fire a couple of questions at you first. Now we've got you back.
Cool.
So, someone has said, I don't have a problem reaching out to trainees, but I feel less confident when I'm reaching out to associates and partners. What's the best way of approaching someone more senior to find out more about their firm?
Well, I guess approaching associates and partners via LinkedIn probably isn't the best route, especially because of how busy they will be, and they're probably not checking their LinkedIn often. But if you're in the context of being in a virtual networking event, for example, and you have the opportunity to ask a question, I think just starting with a bit of humility and coming across as humble, in a sense where you're really excited to learn about what their practice area is a great place to start. Try and narrow down what your question is. If it's a very general question, it can be a bit intimidating in a sense where you're probably thinking, okay, what can this person say? Am I asking the right question? This and that. But if you've narrowed down your question, knowing what their practice area is and potentially a deal they've worked on, you can assume already that they have some information that they can give to you, and it's a qualified question to someone who's qualified to answer it. So that's probably the main tip I would give. Really narrow down what your questions are and personalize it to each person. And yeah, that'd probably be the best route you can take.
Brilliant. Someone else came up with a question that said, have firms ever recruited applicants from a non-Russell Group university? And absolutely, of course they have. I mean, I remember from my university experience, you get kind of channeled into this vortex where you think that the only firms that exist in the world are the top 10 firms, because they're the ones that can afford to keep coming to campus and marketing their brands to you. But there is such a broad range of law firms out there.
Yeah.
Not only that, I know a bunch of people from non-Russell Group universities that have gone on to get top training contracts or trained somewhere and then moved into a top firm. It really depends. I mean, focus on your grades, focus on your experiences and your motivation, and anything is possible. I think if you're consistently getting really bad grades, then there might be some firms that just as a matter of course reject you because then you're not showing the kind of academic consistency they need. But every firm is different, and every firm is after different types of people. So absolutely don't think you can't train a leading city firm just because you didn't go to a non-Russell Group university. Out of interest, which of Harry, Ali, Joe, did all of you do law-based degrees, or some of you come from a non-law background?
I'm non-law.
Brilliant. Ali, as a non-law student, how did you present yourself to firms to give you an edge over people that already had that legal foundation and knowledge from their degree?
Sure, good question. So I was under the impression that studying politics, which is my degree, which is non-law, would put me at a disadvantage because I wouldn't know the statutes that firms and companies would have to comply to. And like, when you do commercial law modules, you get a better understanding of commercial awareness than you would if you do something like history or politics. But though I kind of spun it around and I made it into a strength. So the fact that I'm learning different things has taught me different skills that I can now implement as a commercial lawyer. The content of my politics degree, for example, has exposed me to this new world of debating and critically analyzing different political ideologies, which has allowed me to develop my critical thinking skills. And as a lawyer, you're going to really need that to get through, cases and cases of work. And fundamentally, the content of a politics degree is a deeper understanding into geopolitics. And as you all know, if you read into the news, geopolitics is one of the main factors which affects businesses, especially public companies who have to really rely on good news in order to keep a steady share price. And if you look at what's happening with China and the US and how that affects the currency uncertainty and then how it affects companies by consequence of that, understanding geopolitics allows you to come to a decent conclusion on the matter. And that's basically how I basically went down that avenue. I related geopolitics to commercial awareness, and then how commercial awareness will allow me to become a good lawyer. That was one of the arguments. I gave a few. But what I want you to take away is the understanding that a non-law degree does not have to be a weakness. Plan and think of how different ways your non-law degree can be a strength, because it will differ. The arguments in relation to geopolitics and commercial awareness probably won't be used by a psychology or a history student, but if you sit down and brainstorm, you will be able to come up with 2 or 3 reasons for why a non-law degree can actually be a strength instead of a weakness.
Brilliant. Now I feel so much worse about my own degree, but that was really helpful for everyone. Perfect. So actually, why don't each of you have a go at this question, because it's come up in one way, shape or form a few times. But what would you say are sort of the 2 or 3 key flaws that put firms off candidates at the application stage, which is the hardest stage to get through? Should we go Joe first?
Yeah, I'd say, I don't know, I think a big one, which a lot of people perhaps underestimate, is spelling and grammar. But because, people will check their applications, they'll scan it, 2 to 3 times and assume that they've got everything down, but they won't realize that, there are grammatical mistakes in it that they didn't necessarily know were wrong. I was like this a lot. And I know some firms are very strict on spelling and grammar. I know, for example, Shearman and Sterling, if they have one spelling or grammar mistake, then they're likely to sort of, throw out your application. That's the impression I got. So I think that's a big one. Also, writing in concise sentences. I think, especially in vocational degrees, we have a tendency to want to speak in sort of very verbose language, or be very sort of impressive in the way we speak. That was me anyway. And so I'd write these applications initially like it was an essay, and try and be as complex as possible and try and impress them, because I assume that that's what they're looking for. But it's not. They're looking for something short, punchy and snappy. At the end of the day, these recruiters are going to read hundreds, thousands of applications, and they want something that they don't really have to think too hard about. So I'd say maybe those are the 2 big ones, but I don't know what the other lads are going to say.
Should we go to Harry?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and answer this kind of vicariously in all the sort of interviews I've done in speaking to recruiters directly. And there are 3 pain points that they've always kind of brought up in the podcast interviews and everything I've done. The first is kind of, as Joe said, writing structure, everything from not directly addressing the actual question and using the framing of the question to structure your answer. So for example, if the cover letter says, please detail 3 skills you'd use as a trainee, actually really clearly signposting firstly this, new paragraph, secondly this, thirdly this, and so on. Just the sort of presentation and writing style of what you're saying is so important when there's thousands of other applicants that they're going to have to go through. So definitely writing structure, as Joe said. The second is the use of your experiences. So failing to fully kind of appreciate and bring out the value in something you might have done in something like retail, and trying to kind of understand how the transferable skills and the development of your commercial awareness, or at least how kind of you kind of worked in terms of serving customers and how that works within a business, relates to the commercial law. And fully appreciating and understanding that your extracurricular experiences and quote unquote non-legal experiences are just as important as any ones you might have done the legal fence. So fully utilizing those is the second. And then the third is the use of information and sort of justifying your motivations. So I've heard this firsthand from Baker's graduate recruitment. They say the number of times that they read Baker McKenzie has 70 offices in X amount of countries, and then move on to some other point, or even just, try to bring it together. But basically what I'm saying is, don't regurgitate information that the firm will know better than anyone without a proper kind of use of it, evidencing some kind of motivation that you have. If you're going to bring in a deal and the details of that deal, or at least the kind of bottom line point as to why it's there, link it to some broader point you're making. Try to avoid kind of mentioning things in isolation, because whilst you might not intend for it to come across that way, it could certainly kind of look or appear as though you've sort of found a good snippet which sounds good on their website, and copy and paste it into your application. So definitely writing structure, utilizing all of your experiences, especially the non-legal and extracurricular ones in positions of responsibility, and describing how you went above and beyond them rather than just what your responsibilities were. And finally, your use of information and evidence, trying to avoid regurgitating information and actually applying it in some way.
Awesome. And Ali, how about you?
Yeah, I think the fundamental points have been covered definitely by Harry and Joe. If I was to add something, I would definitely say that when you have a chance to really personalize something, let's just say some firms require like a personal statement. They call it a personal statement, but it's like a cover letter, where it's like 700 words. You can spend as many words as possible to look at things from Google and, speak about how many offices the firm has and what their training program structure is and why you like it. But when you're part of graduate recruitment and you have to read so many different personal statements or cover letters, it gets to a point where you're going to probably read something which you've read at least 20 times. And in your head, you're probably thinking, okay, I've already read this before. Everyone's speaking about it. There's nothing unique here. So if you can actually spend enough time looking at things that the firm in particular is doing that other firms aren't doing, then that would be a real differentiator. One point, which was just using my own personal experiences, which was really, really big last year and the year before, was A&O and Fuse. Like, it was huge to the point where not many people really, really spoke about it. But if you went and you visited and you spent enough time speaking about it, from trainees I heard, they said that it would be a really, really good move to make. But now everyone pretty much knows about A&O and Fuse and their tech investments. And so many other firms are investing in tech by the month. So you need to look into other areas which aren't as common for people to speak about, and that would be a good move. Right now, different firms are making huge moves into different countries that other firms are just not making. And this hasn't really hit the headlines yet. So if you look into things like that, like geopolitical changes and movements in different countries, that would be really, really interesting. But the point is, try and be unique in your approach.
Perfect. And if you're talking about countries, again, like we talked about in the very first session, just relate it back to yourself, explain why a certain type of geographical expansion really resonates with you and aligns with your previous experiences. Actually, leading on from that question, somebody else said firms have really been emphasizing innovation recently. What does that mean? Does it mean innovative ideas to overcome client challenges, or is it more tech related? So I think it's a bit of both. But happy to pass on to Harry here, because I know you've done a bunch of work on your podcast around that.
Yeah, and on that note, I recently spoke to Richard Tromans from Artificial Lawyer, who's all over the space. And one of the best quotes I've had out of that discussion was that people have a tendency to conflate technology and artificial intelligence, the kind of buzzword stuff you'll see with innovation generally, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the case. All those exciting headlines of new developments in technology and robot lawyers all coming along and replacing us are all well and good, but the kind of the core nitty-gritty of how firms will need to innovate are influenced by so many different factors. And I think there's probably two that I'd put out straight off the bat. One is their current existing way of doing business, and for a lot of law firms that's the billable hour, and a process in which employees will charge the work they do on the basis of how long it takes for them to do it is a really big barrier to a lot of changes in the legal industry in ways which might not initially be apparent. So in a sense, if it takes you 2 hours to do a piece of contract review, and there's this threat of this new technology which could do it in 2 minutes, then on a sort of surface level analysis, law firms aren't actually incentivized to go and pursue that piece of technology if what they're currently doing and how they're currently making a lot of money is working as well. The same might extend to their sort of culture and the way that they might make non-technological changes with regards to their sort of pay structure or how they're sort of organizing themselves internally as a company. So the billable hour is a big kind of stickler point for discussion within the industry, not just from an innovation perspective, but more generally on things like well-being and health and everything else. And then secondly, with regards to innovation, on that point of it not always being conflated with technology, one of the biggest problems, as I think we might have slightly covered on the commercial awareness webinar with the introduction of new processes into a business, is the fact that people will be used to doing things the way they have for a long period of time. And even though the technological capability for law firms to move away from wet signatures and trying to work on Word or even by God doing things in handwriting and kind of making amendments on a contract and printing it out and scanning it off to people and trainees, which people are still doing now in 2020, instead of these new systems which can do everything digitally and in the cloud and collaboratively in that sense, is a huge factor. So the specific culture of a firm, the specific people who are in charge of making those decisions also play a big role in how innovation will look. But for the most part, try not to conflate technology with innovation, because there are so many other ways from the non-tech side of things that can take place specifically to law.
Brilliant. Somebody else said, what is the best way to prepare for the Watson Glazer test? And we have Mr. Watson Glazer with us today. I know Joe does his own really well received far longer webinars covering this in detail. Joe, if you had to give just a minute and a half summary of just key tips for preparation, obviously including sign up to any future webinars on the topic, what would you say?
Well, I would have to say, you have to watch my webinar to. I think you really have to go in realizing that it's a very specific type of critical thinking test, and there are techniques you can learn to each of the 5 stages, which mean that you will consistently get the correct answer. I think if I had to sort of broadly boil it down, the important things are to sort of just ignore your own personal biases and opinions about topics. For example, when you're assessing an argument, people will think, oh, if I disagree with something, then it'll be a weak argument, or there can only be one strong argument with this sentence. That's not the case. You have to be completely objective, completely sort of savage with it, and regardless of your personal opinion, you have to throw that out and say, is the structure of this argument strong or is it weak? Does it back itself up with evidence? Is it relevant to the question? Does it address all of the question? So that's certainly one point. I'm trying to think. Another one is with I think it's the inferences section. There's obviously there's a distinction between true, probably true, insufficient data, probably false, and false. It sounds like another language to you if you're not familiar with the Watson Glazer, but in effect, just really knowing what those mean and the definition of them is very important. Obviously, they mean different things within context of the question as well. The same with assumptions as well. If you're asked to decide if an assumption has been made, it's not asking you whether you can assume something, whether you can apply your own knowledge. It's whether the statement in question makes the assumption that is in the answer. It's quite a difficult thing to get head around, but I'll just have to plug my own Watson Glazer. It's just the only
Perfect. And while we're on the topic of tests, somebody else asked about how to approach situational judgment tests. When a client approaches you with an urgent question and your supervisor's busy, or all those sorts of questions. To answer this personally, I think with situational judgment tests, there's no point lying or not giving an answer that doesn't reflect what you would personally want to do, because firms will recruit people. You don't know what the answers are firms are looking for. So you might give an answer that you think the firm wants to hear, and actually that might be the opposite of what the firm wanted to hear, and you've cheated yourself out of an offer by just not being honest. You can't tell. Secondly, if you answer all the questions honestly and the firm decides actually you don't have the character traits they want to work at that firm, that suggests that psychologically you would probably be quite miserable working there because your priorities clearly don't align with the firm. So I guess be honest, but also be realistic. If you're applying to a huge global international firm and it says, everything's gone a bit mad and they desperately need your help and you might have to work until 2 o'clock in the morning to get a deal over the line, but you've got plans to see a friend for dinner at 6 p.m, so you kind of want to leave the office, what would you do? Be realistic about the type of attitude the firm is expecting, but just balance that against your own priorities. And I guess that leads me to a few questions that have come in about balancing parenthood or other kind of priorities and work-life balance with working in law. And the reality is different firms expect different things, and there's not really a huge way around that. I think there's a lot of work to do to enable kind of parents to balance parent life and working life a lot better. And I have a 2-year-old, and my wife is a finance lawyer at a large US firm, and it really is a struggle for us to balance things sometimes, especially in lockdown. But if work-life balance is really important, then maybe focus on firms that you do have more regular hours and you don't have the kind of uncertainty that can follow you around whilst training at one of these much bigger firms. Because that uncertainty will then probably exist right the way through your career if you decide to stay at a firm like that. So it just really depends. But hopefully, with more working from home, things will become a bit more flexible in the future, and diversity initiatives will really start to improve things for all the different types of people that want to go into law. Tying into that, and any of you are welcome to chip in here, one of the questions we got was, do graduate recruitment teams genuinely care about diversity? And I think in short, the answer is yes, but it'd be great if any of you guys wanted to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I'll try not to make this a sales pitch for my firm in doing so. But at least in my experience with Bakers, they were the only firm I ever applied to where they had a question on diversity on the application form. And I think you can generally tell a lot about a firm based on that. And, firms will win diversity initiatives and will kind of try to sort of set up social movements within their own organization and try to provide opportunities for disadvantaged individuals. And that's obviously fantastic. And diversity of background and opportunity is brilliant. And I think this was hinted at in Ali's answer with regards to non-law students as well, but that diversity of thought and diversity of approach to a problem is also equally important. No one really wants to work with 30 Harvey Specter alpha males all the time who all have the same way of doing things and the same way of resolving a conflict and looking at a problem, because ultimately they're going to be less productive and also less creative in terms of how they're providing solutions. So if you are a international student with a different perspective, if you are a non-law student who's been taught a different way, or you have your own unique experiences and coming into the world of law and telling your story, which is in a nutshell what the whole application is kind of about, all that stuff is really useful and really important. And I think certainly, at least from that minimal perspective, most, if not all, firms will care about diversity to that degree. But then sadly, it's how much they agree to that formal definition and how much they carry that through to their practices and in the sort of representation of where they recruit from and who they recruit as well, which can differ. I think that's kind of what the person might have been getting at.
Great.
Yeah, if just to add on to that, I think so. Diversity is really interesting when it comes to the corporate sphere, in a sense where I don't think diversity should ever be the focal point of anyone's application. I know a lot of people press a lot of importance on things like diversity and culture and values, and they are incredible things that should be considered and mentioned when it comes to applications and interviews. But when it comes to articulating your interest for a commercial law firm, diversity should never ever be the main focal point. And I'd say it is also a spectrum as well, right? In a sense where which firms are more diverse than others. A lot of the time, certain industries are just paintbrushed with one image and that's it. Every other company in the industry is the same. But it really, really does depend per firm. It really, really does. In the UK, you will have some firms that are more diverse than others. And in the US, you will have that as well. But understanding which firms they are and getting the statistics can really, really play in your favor, because law firms in applications do love numbers. So if you do want to articulate diversity, fair enough, get the stats, do it, but please don't make it the focal point for why you're interested in that law firm.
Yeah, I'd echo that completely. I think a really good way to do that as well is to go on the law firm profile page on Legal Cheek, and then you can scroll down to the bottom and there's a big pie chart, and you can basically see where they take people from, how many, what proportion of international students, what proportion of non-Russell Group students, and sort of using that data to sort of leverage your own application and application strategy and sort of place your own strength is a really good idea. You know, there are firms out there, you know, that aren't as progressive as others, that will, you know, simply just recruit from Oxbridge or Russell Group unis, and there are others that are much more sort of you know, diverse and wide in their approach as well. So I think, yeah, if you do that, it can definitely play to your advantages.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So another question come in about, do firms have a preference for a diverse range of experiences over academics? And someone else phrased it as in, if I don't have a huge amount of legal practical experience, but have great interpersonal and transferable skills, does that help? And yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was first applying to firms, the only experiences I had to draw upon really were my experiences as a musician, because it'd been 5 years since I left school. I couldn't rely on things like Young Enterprise anymore. So everything was about that. Now, if you only got one source of experiences to draw from, like I did then, it can work against you in the sense that you don't have a diverse range. And I remember failing my first ever phone interview because all of the examples I drew upon were from essentially music and maybe a bit of sport. I didn't have anything professional. As soon as I had started going to employer events and went to the odd open day, that made a big difference. Because talking about that alongside group projects and bits of academia, when I could still talk a lot about music and sport and artistic creative things, but show that I was a bit more of a well-rounded individual. So that's all fine. In terms of, I guess, picking up professional experiences, right now it's never been easier to get a few firm names on your CV, because you can access so many virtual internships online through Bright Network and Inside Sherpa, and sometimes firms do it themselves directly. And that can be enough to show you have a real interest in the career and in the firm, because you've spent your free time trying to gain experience and insights, and then talk about everything else around that. In terms of academics, I once got pushed quite hard in one of my interviews by a partner who said, look, you're on a 2-1 right now. You do loads of extracurriculars. Have you considered giving up some of those extracurriculars so you can push yourself into a first? And I replied with, absolutely not. And he looked a bit shocked and kind of said, why? And I said, well, all the skills I'm developing through all these extracurriculars, I think are far more valuable than what I would gain from giving all that up to spend 15 hours a day in the library trying to make sure I get a first-class degree. I talked earlier about composure, and this is a great example of where composure really kind of worked in my favor, because they kept pushing and saying, but a first is a first. Academically, a first's brilliant. It shows you kind of at the top of your game intellectually. And I stuck to my guns and did end up with a 2-1, but still managed to get a trading contract. And I got positive feedback from that interview because I did stick to my guns and I justified it in a mature way. That doesn't mean that if you are averaging 42% across all of your modules, you should stick to your guns and only do extracurriculars. You need to strike a balance. But there might have been other firms that actually did prefer academics a bit more than extracurriculars, and maybe that's why they are some of the firms that rejected me. It's really hard to know. I mean, you've got to remember the whole way through this, I got rejected by far more firms than accepted me. I just spent a lot of time applying to lots of different firms. So as long as you strike a balance and you hedge your bets with who you apply to, it should be fine, even if you haven't spent multiple days in an actual law firm's office, or you focus a bit more on extracurriculars than academics. I don't know if did one of you guys want to add something to that, or totally down to you?
I think that's a fair point. I think that there was a survey recently of senior partners and decision makers and recruiters about whether they take a 2-1 candidate with some form of business or commercial acumen and experience versus a comparable first candidate who didn't. 71% said they would. And I think that, yeah, your story there, Jake, is a great example of the unquantifiable kind of value of those experiences, both extracurricular or legal or business or otherwise, versus the academic metrics, which are obviously important, but don't always tell the full picture and story and well-roundedness of who a candidate is. And again, I think that's been quite readily reflected in the conversations I've had with recruiters as well. Awesome. I'm glad that kind of made sense. Every time I say, what do you guys think? There's always a chance they're just going to totally conflict with what I said and make it look like I don't know what I'm talking about. That was brilliant. Another one, I was just going to throw this at you guys, but I'll take it. I'll take one for the team first and then see what your answer is. Someone said, how would you effectively answer a question regarding your greatest weakness? And when I first started giving presentations to students, this is the question that I most feared, because it's a really difficult one. To give some general advice, don't pick a weakness that totally strikes at the heart of what you're trying to be. So if I said, my biggest weakness is sometimes I'm just really prone to financial fraud, probably not going to go down really well in the context of trying to be a lawyer where ethics are absolute. So it's fine to pick a weakness that you might need to improve upon. Just make sure you balance that with, I guess, realistically what you'll be expected to do for the role.
So you might say, my biggest weakness is public speaking and the confidence around that. And the important thing is you then explain the active steps you're taking to improve. So you could say, biggest weakness is public speaking, confidence. So I've signed up to the debating club and I've signed up to mooting, and I'm constantly pushing my comfort zone by putting myself in situations where I will need to get more comfortable speaking publicly. And I think that would be a really brilliant answer. It reflects positively on your self-awareness, because you're not just taking some kind of strength and trying to frame it as a weakness. Firms don't like that. And you're also showing that you've got initiative and drive to improve, I guess, your weaker characteristics. You don't all need to answer this, but if any of you have a good example of a weakness, because I'm all out, that would be great.
So I remember I was asked this question in a Jones Day interview, and I said something, very generic, like I think I literally said perfectionist or something. And then, yeah, I know, sorry.
Damn it.
Yeah. They said, what's your second biggest weakness? And I was just stumped because I'd only had one. I had to really scan my brain really quickly. You have to think why they're asking the question. And Jake hit the nail on the head. Obviously, it's to demonstrate self-awareness, but also it's also an opportunity to show that you've worked on something and that you are motivated to improve it. Because obviously they don't expect you to be perfect when you go into the training contract. They want you to be able to identify your flaws and then be able to work on them. So yes, as long as it's not something absolutely detrimental to your entire application, I think you can mention things like, oh, maybe I get nervous public speaking. I always said, I think my second biggest weakness, which was then my first after this, was I'm always hesitant to allocate things because I like taking responsibility, which is kind of a bit of a cop out because it's like a strength and a weakness. But yeah, I think I think it really depends, to be honest. But yeah, you need to remind yourself why they're asking the question. I think it's a good thing to do.
Brilliant. Ali, let's throw one at you. Did you ever have to answer the question, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? Or do you have any advice on answering a question like that?
Yeah, so in relation to this, I think there are a few angles you can take, right? So the conventional answer would be, I'd see myself making money for this law firm, just killing it as an associate. And I'd say the way I would answer this is it would be a bit of a multifaceted answer. So I would take it from a career lens first and say I'd love to train. I'd love to train it and meet more people and grow in terms of a commercial lawyer. I'd love to develop my commercial awareness and be exposed to different businesses, etc., etc. But then also there should be a personal element to this as well. Like, what would you in the next 5 years? How would you like to develop as a person? Maybe in terms of your patience, maybe in terms of your ability to understand people, maybe in terms of your ability to articulate yourself clearly and concisely, to help people on a personal and professional level. There are so many angles you can take. Don't just limit yourself to answer this in a way which only showcases your ability to be a good lawyer. Take it from a personal angle as well. That's how I would personally take it.
Brilliant. Did any of you guys want to kind of add to that, or did that come up for either of you?
I think I did when I was applying to John Lewis retail roles. You had to lie and say I want to be a retail assistant for 20 years or something like that. But no, with law, I go value what Ali said, and I think talking about the type of person you want to be, and I guess more broadly in terms of I want to be a lawyer who's great at doing X, Y, Z and managing these types of things, rather than referring to specifics like I'm going to be partner or I'm going to be doing this and so on, is probably how I would do it, at least.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think if you do talk about specifics, it might come across as slightly contrived as well, because you don't really know. You're very junior at the time, and obviously they have that experience, and I'm sure what they wanted back then is very different to what they want now. So they'll be able to cite that as well. But yeah, I'd echo that too.
Brilliant. Just tick off a couple. Someone said, do firms typically use the same questions throughout application cycles? I would say, don't bank on it. They change. Firms might keep the same questions for a few years, but it doesn't mean they're always going to be the same. And I've seen some firms totally change their applications over the last couple of years compared to when I was applying. If you're asking that question because you want to figure out what you can start working on now before all of the applications open, I think writing a good 250, 300 word model answer to why commercial law, why a specific firm, and then why you could be a really good starting point, because those questions tend to form the basis of the vast majority of applications. Similarly, you could write a short paragraph or two or three well-written bullet points about each of your work experiences, because most firms in the application portal will have somewhere where you can talk about these. Also, having those written down and really well thought about can give you a good point of reference when you're answering questions that you haven't prepared for, like what was your greatest challenge, or when have you ever had to work in a team and dealt with someone that has a different perspective, or something like that. So in case that's where the question was coming from, that could be a good starting point now if you don't have actual applications to work on. Another question, this is a really good question. Someone said, what's a good way to say I don't know when asked a question that you don't know the answer to in an interview? My way of doing this, I would say something like, to be totally honest, I'm not sure, but if I was to have a guess, and then I would say my answer. That does two things. Firstly, it's kind of already excusing yourself for getting it wrong. And secondly, if you happen to guess the right answer, it makes you seem even more clever, because it sounds like it's coming from your logic and your commercial acumen and your intuition, rather than something you've read in a book. I don't know if you guys had some certain strategies in interviews for dealing with unexpected questions or questions you couldn't answer.
A slow drink of water and a lot of nodding and asking to repeat the question might help, but something pretty similar to that, I think. And also perhaps just explaining how you arrived at that answer as well, because even if the end result is quote unquote wrong, I don't know if there's, it could be a yes or no answer, or it could be more of an opinionated one. But if you do reach the wrong answer, you've at least given a bit of an example as to how your thought process has gone about reaching that conclusion. And if you've put into practice some pretty rational and pretty sensible structures in trying to provide a solution or come up with an opinion, and it's just the end result that's wrong, then I think that's still, if anything, quite impressive an answer, and is hinting at what they're sort of looking for in the candidate.
Cool. Yeah. Also just to add on to that, sorry, Jake. So the key here is to be open-minded, right? So starting off by saying I don't know, but then kind of showing them your thought process is a great way to do it. But then many times the interviewer may actually try and guide you. I don't know, I've experienced that. I don't know if you guys have, but they'll try and guide you down a route to a certain answer and say, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And it's always a good move to say, oh, I didn't consider that. I would do this and that. And just like go back and forward with them. But sometimes if the route they're showing you actually makes sense, being stubborn and sticking to your guns when you're not even confident in relation to your own answer may not pay dividends. So being open-minded and assessing the situation and potentially going down a similar route to them in a situation like that, in that context, can actually pay off, in my own experiences.
Yeah, I think making an estimated guess is a good idea, especially if it's within the context of maybe a commercial or technical question. You can inform your answer or your estimated guess, I suppose, with what you know about that particular sector or practice area, and then it'll help them lead you on that journey too. So it's always a nerve-wracking situation, but I think you just have to maybe estimate a guess is what I would do.
Brilliant. I'll quick fire a couple more, and then I've got a few left for you guys at the bottom. So someone said, would you say that high school or sixth form leadership and activity experiences are still relevant, or would that be too long ago? For me, it would have been too long ago. There was probably almost 10 years between me doing Young Enterprise and me applying for VAC schemes, because I had that 5 years out trying to make it, failing to make it in music. But if you're a first year student applying for an open day and just 2 years before you were head boy or head girl, or you'd taken part in Model United Nations or something like that, then absolutely it's totally fine to draw upon that, because that is still your recent history. I think 3 years is fine for something really impressive. Maybe you could stretch to 4 years or slightly longer, especially if it's something you've done for a very long time, like, I don't know, national swimming championships or black belt karate or something you'd worked out right the way through school. So yeah, more stuff might be relevant than you expect. Someone else said, do you know if being an international student helps or hinders your chances when it comes to applying to firms? I think it really depends. If you're an international student and you've lived and worked in different countries, then you can absolutely use that to your advantage. If you're talking about adaptability and an interest in working with different cultures and working internationally, and you can back that up by saying you've worked and studied and lived in different countries and you're bilingual or trilingual, of course that's going to reflect really well. I don't think it works against you. That there might be smaller firms that can't afford to sponsor visas. So it's always worth checking what firms' policies are on that. But for the large firms, I had friends from all over the world who I trained with at Freshfields, and I'm sure it's the same for most of the top firms. So yeah, worth checking in advance, but I don't think it's a hindrance. And if you spin it well in the way you talk about your competencies and experiences, it can definitely work in your favor. question to you guys. So someone says, what would be your top tips to develop yourself during an undergraduate degree to help you stand out in the application process and personally develop?
I would say that I think the best move you can make is to get out there as much as possible, right? So your degree is literally going to go in a flash pretty quickly. And you don't want to be one of those people who really regret not taking part in anything, in a sense where, for example, in my experience, I did take part in extracurricular activities. I had my own news page. I got more serious with YouTube. I created content. I did some collaborations with people. But one thing I do regret is not taking part in a large society. I did take part in a small one, but not a bigger one. Because taking part in these societies and these things inside of your uni, first of all, is accessible to you. And second of all, it's a fantastic opportunity to develop skills that you are going to need to mention and articulate in your interviews. It's pretty much a no-brainer, right? So taking a position of responsibility as a secretary in a society which has, I don't know, 200 members at least, and then liaising with other societies or other organizations and working in small teams and working under, sensitive time restrictions and time limits. All of these are basically, first of all, you're developing your ability to develop these skills. And second of all, these are gateways to actually enter firms and be able to articulate why you would be a good commercial lawyer in these firms. So I think societies are really accessible, and that's something you should do. And if you want to go to another length and go further than that, then starting your own organizations outside of university would be fantastic as well. And if you remember the session we did before, LinkedIn is a fantastic place to meet like-minded people who you can connect with, and using filters and asking people certain questions, you can pretty much narrow down who would be a good candidate to start an organization with. And look at potentially starting something with them, such as like a CV review company, like a mentoring organization, whatever it is. It's actually in the grasp of your hands. So it's within your reach. So I'd say definitely look into starting organizations outside of uni, but also take roles inside of uni, which is more accessible, I think. And that would definitely help you when it comes to developing the core skills that you would need when it comes to interviews and applications.
Brilliant. I think so many more questions are coming in. I might just fire different questions at Joe and Harry, if that's okay with you guys. Joe, someone said, if you in particular, how did you manage to shift your mindset between first year and second year when it came to then totally transforming your approach to academics and boosting your grades, whilst also balancing extracurriculars and applying for firms?
Yeah, it wasn't easy. So it was a big sort of lifestyle shift for me. So first year, I just assumed first year, doesn't really count. Let's just enjoy it. And also I was rowing a lot. So, that was sort of 8 sessions a week. So that took up a lot of my time as well. And then into second year, I realized actually I've really got to focus on my academics. I think the most pivotal thing I did was, I got all my shocking results in first year. I sat down with each of my tutors and just, painstakingly went over exactly where I went wrong in the exams, why my exam technique wasn't cracking it. And it was quite a painful process, and it's hard not to take personally. So when you're repetitively being told that you're not good enough, but it was such a crucial step for me in terms of in terms of self-awareness of what I was doing wrong. And if I wasn't able to pinpoint exactly where I was going wrong, I wouldn't have been able to go right. And I think secondly was, the lifestyle shift. I was much more sensible, had a much more healthy lifestyle. I would sort of go to, wake up earlier, get my work done in the mornings, use my free time more constructively. Because at the end of the day, with a law degree, there's no real getting away from the hard hours you need to put in terms of investing into extra reading and, really perfecting that exam technique. And I think really keeping up that communication with the people that are actually marking your papers is very important, just so you know that you're on the right lines. So yeah, it wasn't a quick solution. It was pretty painful graft. But if you're as disappointed in your results as I was, I had the fuel to do it. So I think that was what it was with me.
Brilliant. I think that shows real resilience as well, where you've kind of been told all this criticism and then you managed to bounce back from it. So it's the kind of example you could definitely draw upon during an interview. And remember, once you get through to the interview stage, your grades are not going to hold you back anymore. You might be grilled on them and asked about them. You might have to justify certain things, but you wouldn't have been brought through to the interview stage if your grades were going to be a sticking point. Cool. On a separate topic, Harry, you weren't with Hannah and I when we were talking about research earlier on, and someone said, what resources did you personally use to research firms? So do you have some examples you could share?
Yeah, so there'll be a few that I'm sure a lot of people will hear before in webinars, Google Alerts, the firm's social media and websites and everything else. And I won't repeat those for the sake of time. A couple that I used that were quite useful as differentiators and helped kind of give me a great level of insight. The first was annual reports and the kind of yearly reports that firms will be producing on everything from their finances through to their company vision, through to a breakdown of what they're doing in each sector or in each location. They're really quite long. They're very full of numbers, but they provide a lot of really useful information, and not just for the purposes of putting into an application form, but for you before you begin writing it to decide if that's the place you want to work for as a firm. A couple of really important ones, especially if you're a trainee, is the trainee retention rate. So is this firm actually growing? Is this firm looking to continue to seek and develop their trainees? And is there going to be a job for you at the end of the training contract? And practice areas as well. If you've got a particular area in a given practice area of law, how kind of sort of central is that to everything that the firm is doing, and is that a growth area, or is it more sort of supplementary role? So annual reports are a good thing to use both for applications and also just generally for finding out if that's what you want to do in terms of researching a firm. And then secondly was much more sort of anecdotal, so everything from speaking to individual trainees or future trainees and people at the firm just to get a sense of what they personally viewed and trying to get a view of their culture, or listening to interviews with the sort of global head of the firm or the managing partners of the firm, people who are there in the decision-making process, so you can see, you know, across those two resources, hopefully what the firm is, where the firm is at now, and what they're hopefully trying to achieve in future. And basically you can decide if you want it to be a part of that. If you bundle all of those resources alongside everything else, like the True Picture Chambers Guide and Legal Cheat, like Joe said, and all these other online sources, you'll hopefully have a pretty good understanding of kind of what the firm provides in a bigger picture, and you can make that personal decision to apply or not, and also have a bit of evidence to include in your application as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. Next question was, if all your applications last year were rejected, what can you do to improve for the upcoming cycle? And I think one of the things is send your applications to friends and family to read, because the more time you spend on something written, the more likely it is that you will read what you think or what you intended to write, rather than what you've actually written. And that's how you miss errors. I mean, I do a lot of copywriting for a living, and I make so many mistakes that I don't notice even after reading something 5 or 6 times. So that could be one thing to do. Second thing, reflect on whether your applications do show you as a well-rounded individual. Do you have at least 1 or 2 examples that are professional and a couple that are extracurricular and just show that you're the kind of person that would fit into the firm's culture? Make sure you've got all of that there. And then based on everything we discussed earlier today and all the resources you can read, just make sure your answers to firm motivation questions, as Harry has said, are as specific as possible. Maybe you underestimated that question before today's session, where we kind of explained why these matter and how much it costs to train people and why you need to really show your commitment. So that might be an important one to think about. Somebody else said, I want to work at an international firm because I think the level of professionalism is much greater than it is at smaller firms. Is it okay to answer that way? What I would say is I would never criticize other firms in your answers. And this was some great advice I was given before my interviews, because if you criticize a firm in an interview, your interviewer might think, well, what are they saying about us when they speak to other people? So focus on the positives of the firm you're speaking to rather than the negatives. I mean, I work at this fantastic West End firm that focuses on startups and scale-ups. It's far more high street in terms of size than someone like Freshfields or Hogan Lovells. But all the lawyers there have come from leading city firms. So there's certainly no less professionalism in the type of work they deliver. Instead, you could say, I want to work at an international firm because I believe international cross-border deals are the most complex, and they have the most profile, and therefore the work will be the most interesting, and it will align with my international mindset. And maybe that's the type of approach you can take, you know, wanting to work for clients that you've heard of and known of for many years, and working with, I guess, local counsel in different countries around the world and different offices. You're almost saying the same thing, but without being negative about other firms. Another question here. Someone says, do you have advice for structuring how you write about work experiences on an application? Do you just mention skills and star, or how would you approach that? So, Joe, shall I send that one to you?
Yeah, I think firstly it depends on how much space you're given. So obviously in the context of a CV, you're not given much space at all. So you're meant to have quite a sort of impactful what you did and sort of what your responsibilities were, and then allow the recruiter to infer what the transferable competencies are from that. If you have more more time or more space, you know, for example, a 200, 250 word work experience section, then feel free to, you know, use those extra words to really convince and paint a picture of how these competencies you developed were transferable, and sort of, you know, really try and focus in on the core values and the core competencies of that firm in particular values. For example, you know, in my application strategy applying to US firms, I'd really try to highlight, you know, positions of responsibility quite a lot, entrepreneurialism, things like that, you know, wanting to take on this extra responsibility. Whereas at other firms, you know, maybe you should highlight sort of teamwork, or not saying that those don't apply to either firm, but they might privilege more things over others, and showing that you can really bring out these competencies in your work experience shows that you can sort of tailor it to an extent to the firm. But yeah, it depends on, you know, the words you're given, but yeah, quite a difficult one really.
Actually, Joe, that leads to another question that came through that said, how can you link entrepreneurial spirit to being a commercial lawyer? So if you were talking about your entrepreneurial spirit, I guess what examples did you give to show that? And how did you tie that into your suitability as a candidate?
Yeah, I mean, well, for example, like a K&E sort of prides itself on its entrepreneurial culture. So you're given high amounts of responsibility from the outset. So you're talking to clients within your first week. So showing that, you know, you have demonstrated these sort of strong positions of responsibility is a great way of sort of linking that, show that you'll be ready for this entrepreneurial culture, that you're not going to sort of be a wallflower and shy away from these, you know, these working with these big boy clients at an early stage. It depends on your experiences. I would say if you're still at university, then really try and invest in, as Ali was really rightly saying, these positions of responsibility. It's so key, especially at a lot of commercial law firms, especially the US firm. I'm sure a lot of other firms too. But yeah, I think that's probably the best advice I would give for that.
Brilliant. I'll take a quick one here. It says, if you study a non-law degree, are you expected to have the same levels of knowledge on tax law and pensions and that kind of thing? Being honest, as part of your academic law degree, you don't learn about many of the commercial topics that we talked about in the previous presentation. I never remember covering warranties and indemnities and conditions precedent and all those kind of contractual protections when I was an undergraduate law student. You do come across that more on the LPC. So I think it will give you an edge to know this kind of stuff, because it means you can apply it more confidently in a case study situation. But don't assume that law students have a massive benefit over you because they've studied law previously. I mean, a law student is probably more likely to get asked about contract law questions or tort law questions in an interview, although it doesn't happen very often. I can't imagine a firm asking about contract law cases to someone they can see has studied geography for 2 years, because there's no reason why they would need to know that. So don't worry too much about comparing yourself to law students, or law students comparing themselves to non-law students. A lot of this stuff you can pick up fairly easily now from kind of my book and Joe's resources and Ali's YouTube channel and Harry's commercial awareness guide that you'll get later on. The trick is then to really understand that stuff, do some further research, and figuring out how you can apply that flexibly in the context of a case study. Do you guys have anything specific to say about like kind of how much detail you need to know about all the commercial stuff?
I think most of the stuff that I ended up talking about with regards to basic economic concepts, I covered at AS level in my business and economics class, and I'd imagine that's a pretty sort of comparable academic level, I think, as to what I talked about in my interviews, and what would be, I guess, useful for the purposes of applications interviews. And I think, like we said throughout this webinar, anything else which is a bit more specific or you don't understand, there's resources out there, especially like the Investopedia one, where you can go and do a bit of a deep dive on a given topic. Or I love YouTube explainer videos which use animations and go really sort of in depth, for podcast interviews as well. So yeah, I think for me it was just A-level economics is a really good place to start. Have a look at textbooks or past papers and try to see what concepts they cover, because that's what I've sort of relied upon today.
Yeah. Also, sorry, quickly. I would say that it does depend on the firm as well. So some firms, well, an experience I had with one Magic Circle firm was that the partner did expect me to kind of understand what legal safeguards businesses have to basically use and comply to. When it comes to protecting themselves against, it was something, but it was related to understanding which laws are important. And the partner knew I wasn't on law because I don't think it was a blind CV. And I think the partner did expect an answer, and I kind of waffled and I panicked. But I think the best thing that you could do if you do come across a situation like that, where you just don't know anything about contract law because you haven't been taught it or haven't looked into it, is just kind of admitting that you're not a law student. But you are willing to look more into it. But when it comes to basic, terms that you kind of should know as an aspiring commercial lawyer, which is covered by the Commercial Law Handbook, like safeguards, like indemnities or, insurance, etc., that you can read and you can kind of look into it. And you may be expected to know that as a non-law student. But deeper legal knowledge, you wouldn't necessarily know it, but be willing to admit that you're not a law student if you are asked it. I think that's a takeaway.
Awesome. I think we're coming towards the end now. We got one question, which I was going to send to you, Ali. I'll still send this to you first, where someone said, how do you reflect on your experiences to build constructive digital content? And I think the reason that's a relevant question is we talked a lot earlier on about networking and using LinkedIn to try and create opportunities for yourself. And obviously a good way to engage on LinkedIn is to produce content that resonates with people. So I guess if each of you answer this, that would be really helpful. How do you decide which content to publish, and how do you make sure it's constructive and authentic? But maybe starting with Ali.
Yeah, so it's a weird one, because I guess there is a fine line when it comes to giving advice, right? So if you've had an experience and you've genuinely learned something from it, then that is something you can basically articulate via LinkedIn, and it's fine to articulate it. Maybe give a few references of the articles that you learned it from, whatever it is. But if it comes to something which is a bit more negative, in a sense where you've experienced something and there isn't exactly a lesson to learn from it, but it's more complaining, it may not set the right tone for your LinkedIn career, right? So I've seen this a lot, and it doesn't set a nice impression. So if you've learned something and someone has given you valuable information, articulate it in a very concise manner, and think of it as if you're basically having a short conversation with someone, which is around 20 seconds, and you want to write a few sentences about it. And that can really help you build meaningful and trust-based relationships with people, because then you become this friendly face in this competitive corporate world who is willing to share information. So that's how I would really articulate it. Concise and value-based, but also if there is no lesson, then don't mention it.
Brilliant. And Joe, how about you? How do you decide what to prioritize?
In terms of content, I'm not very original, to be honest. I just sort of think about all the mistakes I made, which were loads in the application process, and think which was the most sort of relevant and which I wish I knew earlier. And I just sort of, I think if I came across some incredible people such as the panel today on LinkedIn, and it definitely helped me out a lot. So I thought, imagine there's someone who doesn't have access to that. They're going to be making all these mistakes. So let's try and sort of spread awareness for these big mistakes that people make, and therefore sort of guide on how to correct them. Because you can be a great candidate and just be making these very simple errors and just be missing out on these great opportunities. So that was my sort of way into it. I tend to just stick to things relating to applications. I'm not incredibly creative like that. That's probably what I'm going to stick to as well. But I think that's normally what I do. It's more application based, and reflecting on my own failures, really.
Awesome. And Harry, how about yourself?
Pretty simple, really. Just what would I have wanted 2 years ago as a resource to save myself time and effort, or reflect on something in hindsight that I would have wanted back then that I've learned now. The reason I like that rule is because it applies if you've got a training contract or not, if you're joining university, if you're applying to university, wherever you're at in your career, there will be people sort of, I guess, earlier sort of behind you in terms of their development, and looking to reach the stage you're at now, or at least try to learn more about something that you're currently doing. And that 2-year rule is really useful. But producing content is useful. It's certainly not a prerequisite or a necessary thing to do in order to secure a TC or anything like that. And I think, if anything, if it sounds really scary and it doesn't interest you, don't do it. And perhaps consider starting with the kind of 9% rule of engaging with people and kind of commenting and sharing posts and getting involved with what other people are already creating before you make the jump to join the 1% of creators who actually come up with original stuff themselves, because that will help with the confidence and inspiration side of things too. Brilliant.
We've got one final question, which I think each of us can give our answer to now, which would be a really, really nice way to wrap up. This question is, looking back, what advice would you have given yourself at the start of the application period? So I think my advice to myself would have been not to get so wrapped up in comparing myself to other people and thinking, oh, that person's got an unbelievably good grade and they went to Oxbridge and I didn't, or that person has done 12 billion internships and this is my interview for my very first one, so that I haven't got a chance. I would have focused less on that kind of thing and just focused more on my own preparation and that kind of thing. and I probably wouldn't have said that I spoke basic Mandarin and Hindi on my CV, so I wouldn't have had to spend 2 days trying to figure out what I was taught years earlier. But that's it for me. Should we go to Ali next?
Yeah, sure. I think mine would have been more of a mental game as opposed to actually doing things, because I went to the open days, I networked, I created content, that's all well and good. But when you're in this mindset where you feel like as soon as you tick boxes, everything's going to be okay, you're going to smash it, it's a complacent mindset. And I think I became complacent because I was ticking the boxes, which in theory should have given me 15 training contracts. But you have to understand that unfortunately in practice, this won't happen. And you need to be okay with learning and appreciating the process. Keep ticking the boxes, but be very open-minded to changing your strategy when that's needed. And that's something I wish I used as a core philosophy maybe a year or two ago.
Brilliant. How about you, Joe?
Yeah, I would say similar to both of you, really, it's a bit of a mental game. I think a big issue I struggled with was especially with assessment centers, because I'll turn up to these things thinking I'm a massive imposter, and I just wasn't good enough. And there were so many impressive people everywhere around you, and I felt like I wasn't really, didn't really deserve to be there. So it's a big question of self-belief. Got to remind yourself why you're there, what you've done. You've talked the talk, now you need to walk the walk. And really hone in on those competencies you've developed, and just really try and focus on yourself in the assessment center. Don't be distracted by other people, because it can be quite sort of psychologically detrimental. That's what I found personally. So yeah, just really focus on yourself and the task at hand, I think, was a big one for me.
Awesome. And finally, Harry.
Yeah, just to echo what you said, Jake. This fact really baffled me and surprised me when I heard it, but the average age of a qualifying solicitor is 29 in the UK, and it's very easy, especially if you're a student, to get wrapped up in the self-perception that you need to be in a certain position when you leave university and what everyone else is doing as well. I think just bear in mind that throughout the whole application process, especially for the written one, which you might not even get feedback for at all, it's very difficult to know the difference between just about making it to the next stage and completely failing and messing it up, because the response and automated email suggestion you'll get from the firm is the same. I think instead try to focus on your own journey and recognize that all the little things of your routine and your daily habits and doing things for a prolonged period of time over, say, a course of 4 to 5 months, rather than just focusing on this 1 month window of when applications are happening and doing things 2 weeks before the deadline and stressing yourself out, is a much more effective method, and one which I wish I'd taken sooner.